October 25th, 1415. 6,000 starving Englishmen stand in a muddy field, facing 36,000 French knights in the finest armor Europe can forge. The French are so confident they're arguing over who gets to capture the English king alive. 4 hours later, 10,000 Frenchmen are dead. England lost 400. The age of the armored knight, 500 years of dominance, ended in one afternoon, killed by peasants with bent sticks and string. This is Agincourt, where medieval warfare drowned in the mud. But before we dive into this massacre, if you love real history told like a movie, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you Team England or Team France? Let's get into it. In April 1413, Henry V ascended to England's throne at age 26. His kingdom held almost nothing in France. Only Calais and a scrap of Gascony remained from centuries of Plantagenet glory. Henry claimed the French crown through his great-grandfather, Edward III. France rejected every demand. By 1415, negotiations collapsed. Henry borrowed $220,000 from London merchants, pawning Richard II's jeweled crown as collateral. He assembled 12,000 men and hundreds of ships. On August 13th, 1415, the fleet crossed the Channel. The invasion had begun. France, torn by civil war between Armagnac and Burgundian factions, did not expect what came next. Henry landed in Normandy with purpose. The 100 Years' War, dormant for decades, ignited again. Henry marched his army to Harfleur, a strategic port at the Seine's mouth. He expected the town to fall within days. It held for 5 brutal weeks. English cannons pounded stone walls. French defenders repaired breaches every night. Then dysentery struck the English camp. Men died, vomiting blood and defecating themselves hollow. By September 22nd, when Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry had lost a third of his force, 4,000 men dead or too sick to march. He left a garrison to hold the town. Winter approached. The campaign season was ending. Henry faced a choice: retreat to England having captured only one port, or march his depleted army north to Calais as a show of strength. He chose the march. It was a decision that would define his reign. On October 8th, 9,000 exhausted men left Harfleur heading for Calais. They carried 1 week's supplies for what should have been an 8-day march. Henry moved through Normandy, expecting to cross the Somme River quickly. French forces shadowed them, blocking every ford. The English detoured inland, marching farther upstream. Days stretched into weeks. Food ran low. Dysentery continued killing men daily. Some archers cut off their soiled undergarments to let nature take its course while walking. They covered 200 miles in 16 days. Finally, on October 19th, they crossed the Somme at an undefended ford. Calais lay 45 miles north. Then French scouts appeared on the horizon. A massive army had intercepted them near the village of Agincourt. The trap had closed. October 24th, 1415. The French army assembled near Agincourt, perhaps 12,000 men, possibly far more. Constable Charles d'Albret commanded alongside Marshal Boucicaut, but 5 dukes, 8 counts and dozens of nobles created a fractured command. They outnumbered Henry's exhausted force by at least 2 to 1. The battlefield was a recently ploughed field between 2 woods, narrowing toward the English position. Rain had fallen for days. The clay soil had become a quagmire. Deep furrows carved for winter wheat planting turned into flooded trenches. Henry positioned his army at the field's narrowest point. Woods anchored both flanks. He placed 5,000 longbowmen on the wings. His 1,500 men-at-arms would fight on foot, abandoning their horses. For English nobles to dismount and stand like common infantry was unprecedented. It was also brilliant. Henry had chosen his killing ground. Darkness fell on October 24th. The French camped in sight of English lines. French nobles argued over who would have the honor of capturing Henry alive. They divided imaginary ransoms. Some bragged they would drag the English king to Paris in chains before nightfall. Constable d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut advised patience, surround the English and starve them into surrender. Younger nobles overruled them. They wanted immediate battle, overwhelming force, glorious victory. Meanwhile, Henry ordered absolute silence in his camp on pain of losing an ear. His men spent the night in cold terror. They knelt and kissed the muddy ground, knowing many would return to the earth tomorrow. English archers sharpened wooden stakes and whispered prayers. Dawn came cold and grey. It was St. Crispin's Day, October 25th, 1415. History would remember what happened next. At dawn, both armies faced each other across 800 yards of muddy field. Neither moved. The French waited for reinforcements, dukes still riding to join the glory. Henry waited because advancing meant his archers would be vulnerable during the march. Hours passed. Rain began again, then stopped. The field grew muddier. At mid-morning, Henry made his decision. He ordered his army forward 300 yards into longbow range. Archers carried their sharpened stakes, replanting them as they advanced. The movement took 30 minutes. French commanders watched but did not attack. Finally, Henry gave the signal. English archers loosed 2 volleys at the French lines. The arrows had limited effect at extreme range against armored men, but the provocation achieved its purpose. The French honor guard could not stand still while being shot. The massive army began to move. The Battle of Agincourt had begun. They had taught themselves that nobility meant invincibility. The mud would teach them otherwise. Fighting commenced at 11 a.m. 2 wings of French cavalry, perhaps 400 mounted knights on each flank, thundered forward to destroy the English archers. The Count of Vendôme commanded the right wing. Sir Cligny de Brabant led the left. Their mission was simple: ride down the peasant bowmen, then wheel inward to strike the English centre from behind. The tactic had worked at other battles, but those battles had not been fought in mud. Within seconds, the charge began to falter. Horses sank fetlock deep into clay. The gallop became a canter. The canter became a laboured trot. Riders spurred desperately. Their mounts floundered. And then the arrows came. 5,000 longbows released simultaneously. The sky darkened. 60,000 arrows per minute fell on the French cavalry. The sound was like continuous thunder. Horses screamed as shafts punched through their eyes, mouths, and unarmored legs. A destrier hit by 3 arrows would rear and throw its rider. A horse blinded by a bodkin point would crash into its neighbor. The formations disintegrated. Some knights made it to within 50 yards of the English stakes. There, the wounded, panicked horses impaled themselves on sharpened wood. Riders crashed into the mud. The few who reached the archer lines were pulled from their saddles and bludgeoned with mallets. Within minutes, both cavalry wings had shattered. Riderless horses galloped back through the advancing French infantry, trampling men in their panic. The churning hooves turned the field into a muddy swamp. The first phase had failed catastrophically. The French vanguard, 8,000 men-at-arms in full-plate armor, began their advance on foot. They had dismounted to avoid what happened to the cavalry. Constable d'Albret commanded the center. The Dukes of Orleans and Bourbon marched with the front ranks. These were the greatest nobles in France, in the finest armor Europe could forge. Each suit cost more than a village earned in a year. They began crossing the 800 yards of open field. The mud immediately betrayed them. Clay sucked at their steel sabatons. The furrows became traps. Men wearing 60 pounds of armor sank to their knees with each step. The monk of St. Denis wrote, "They were already overcome with fatigue even before they advanced against the enemy." And the arrows never stopped falling. At 300 yards, longbow arrows began finding gaps in armor. Shafts drove through mail at the armpits. Bodkin points punched through visors into faces. Even arrows that failed to penetrate still hit like hammer blows. Knights staggered under the impacts. Some fell and could not rise from the mud. Those behind trampled over them, unable to stop their own forward momentum. The vanguard compressed as the field narrowed toward the English position. 8,000 men were being funneled into a space 300 yards wide. They pressed shoulder to shoulder, unable to raise their weapons. The front ranks couldn't retreat. The ranks behind pushed them forward. The English archers shot methodically, choosing targets. A French knight might be hit by 5 arrows before he advanced 100 yards. The advance had become a death march. By the time the French vanguard reached the English lines, they were already defeated. The quarter-mile slog through mud in full armor, enduring constant arrow fire, had destroyed them. Pierre Cochon wrote that they sank into the ground by at least a foot with each step. The heat inside their armor was suffocating. Visors fogged. Breathing became desperate, gasping. Their hearts hammered against their ribs. Muscles screamed with lactic acid. When they finally crashed into the English men-at-arms, they could barely lift their weapons. Some simply stood there, too exhausted to fight, waiting to be killed or captured. The crush of bodies became so tight that knights couldn't swing swords. They grappled and shoved instead, trying to knock opponents down. And in that press of metal and flesh, the battle entered its most horrific phase. The English men-at-arms held their ground. They fought in tight formation, 4 ranks deep, supporting each other's weight. The French, exhausted and compressed, had no room to maneuver. Then the English archers dropped their bows. They grabbed the mallets they had used to drive stakes, the hatchets from their belts, the swords they carried for close combat. 7,000 lightly armored men charged into the flanks of the French formation. The archers were not weakened by armor or fatigue. They moved quickly through the mud in leather jerkins and wool. They swarmed the struggling French knights like wolves on wounded elk. A mallet to the helmet, a dagger through the eye slit. A dozen men dragging one knight down into the mud. It wasn't combat. It was slaughter wearing the mask of battle. French knights who fell could not get up. The weight of their armor pressed them face down into the mud. Some drowned in 2 inches of bloody water. Others suffocated inside their helmets as mud blocked the breathing slits. The living fell on top of the dying. A second wave of French men-at-arms pushed forward from behind, unable to see what was happening at the front. They climbed over the pile of bodies and were themselves cut down. A chronicler described 3 great heaps of the slain around the 3 main English standards. The piles grew taller. Men climbed corpses to reach the English line, only to be knocked backward into the growing mound. The battlefield stenched of blood, shit, and vomit. And still, the French kept coming, unable to believe what was happening to them. Henry fought in the front rank with his household guard. He wielded a warhammer, crushing helmets and breaking bones. When his brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was wounded in the groin, Henry stood over him, holding back French knights until Humphrey could be dragged to safety. A French axe struck Henry's helmet, knocking off part of his crown. He did not step back. The Duke of York died beside him, trampled into the mud. Henry kept fighting. His presence in the melee inspired his men. English soldiers saw their king standing with them, bleeding with them. The French saw something else, a young man who would not be intimidated by numbers or nobility. Henry's courage in that moment became legend. But courage alone was not winning the battle. Terrain, tactics, and technology were destroying France's finest army. The Duke of Alençon led the second wave forward. He had watched the vanguard's destruction, but believed weight of numbers would prevail. His division pushed into the same killing ground. They encountered the same mud, the same exhaustion, the same arrows. By the time they reached English lines, they added only to the chaos. There was no coordinated attack anymore. Just thousands of individual knights trying to kill their way through a prepared enemy on ground that had already been churned into liquid filth. Alençon fought his way to Henry himself and nearly killed the king. Then English guards cut him down. His death broke the second wave's momentum. The French attack was collapsing, but the battle was not over. Something worse was about to happen. By early afternoon, the English had taken hundreds of prisoners. French nobles surrendered, expecting the usual ransom arrangements. English soldiers saw gold on legs. Each captured knight represented months or years of wages. They herded prisoners to the rear, already calculating their fortunes. The main French force was broken. Bodies carpeted the field so thick you could walk 50 yards without touching mud. The English believed they had won. Then word reached Henry. A French force had attacked his baggage train in the rear. Local lords Isambard d'Agincourt and Robinet de Bournonville had led 600 peasants in a raid, seizing some of Henry's treasures. Worse, French reserves were still on the field. Henry feared the battle might restart, and he had more prisoners than soldiers. Henry made a decision that would stain his victory forever. He ordered the execution of all prisoners except the most valuable nobles. His knights refused. Killing unarmed captives violated every code of chivalry. Henry threatened to hang anyone who disobeyed. Finally, he ordered 200 archers to carry out the massacre. The archers obeyed. What followed appalled even medieval chroniclers accustomed to battlefield horror. Prisoners had their helmets removed and throats cut. Some were stabbed through the eye slits of their bassinets. Others were herded into a barn that was set ablaze. A French knight later testified that he watched a dozen comrades locked inside a building as it burned. The killing took perhaps 30 minutes. Between 2,000 and 3,000 French nobles died. Only dukes and counts worth massive ransoms were spared. The French third line watched from a distance. They saw their own nobles, disarmed and helpless, being systematically murdered. They saw the smoke from the burning barn. They saw English archers wiping blood from their daggers. The psychological impact was total. These men had marched to Agincourt expecting glorious battle and easy victory. Instead, they had watched 2 waves destroyed in mud, and now witnessed their captured comrades butchered like cattle. The French reserves did not attack. They did not advance. They turned and left the field without striking a blow. The battle was over. The field at Agincourt had become a monument to the death of an era, and the English stood victorious among mountains of French dead. After the French departure, the English began tallying casualties. They walked the field, pulling arrows from corpses to reuse. French bodies lay in piles 6 feet high. The traditional method of counting enemy dead was cutting off their right ears. The English filled 9 large leather sacks. Contemporary sources claimed between 6,000 and 10,000 French had died. Modern historians estimate closer to 6,000 confirmed dead. Among them Constable Charles d'Albret. 3 dukes, Alençon, Bar, Brabant, 9 counts, 90 barons, almost 2,000 knights. The Admiral of France, the Master of Crossbowmen and his 3 sons, an archbishop. One chronicler wrote, "The list read like a roll call of the military and political leaders of the past generation." 40% of French nobility had been eliminated in 6 hours. The English counted their own dead. The numbers seemed impossible. Approximately 400 men had died. Some sources claimed as few as 100. Even the highest estimates put English casualties under 1,000. Against at least 6,000 French dead, the disparity was almost unbelievable. The Duke of York, trampled in the melee. The Earl of Suffolk, killed in the first charge. Perhaps 300 common soldiers and archers. That was all. 1 English knight dead for every 15 French nobles. The chroniclers recorded the numbers, but could barely credit them. Some attributed the victory to divine intervention, but there was nothing divine about what had happened. It was terrain, technology, tactics, and the catastrophic arrogance of an army that had forgotten how to lose. When the fighting ended, the battlefield was a vision from hell. Bodies lay so thick that in places you could walk 100 yards without touching mud. Carrion birds circled in clouds so dense they darkened the afternoon sun. The wounded, who could not be moved, lay moaning among the dead. Some died slowly from arrow wounds. Others drowned as the tide of bodies shifted. The stench was overwhelming: blood, excrement, vomit, and death. Local peasants would later claim you could smell the battlefield from 3 miles away. English soldiers stripped armor from corpses. Some French knights had died so recently their bodies were still warm. The finest plate armor in Europe became plunder. Gold spurs, jeweled daggers, silk surcoats, all taken. The field would yield bones and rusted metal for the next 50 years. Henry ordered his army to resume the march to Calais. They left Agincourt on October 26th, moving slowly through exhaustion. This time, no French army blocked their path. The march that had been desperate before was now triumphant. Villages that might have resisted opened their gates. Word of Agincourt's slaughter had already spread. The English reached Calais without further combat. There, Henry embarked his army for England, bringing hundreds of captured French nobles as proof of victory. The most valuable prisoner was Charles, Duke of Orleans, nephew of the French king. He would spend the next 25 years imprisoned in the Tower of London. The ransom from prisoners would eventually exceed the entire cost of Henry's campaign. The invasion had been financed by France's own nobility. Henry landed in England on November 16th, 1415. London had prepared a reception unlike anything the city had seen. 20,000 citizens lined the streets. Choirs sang. Maidens in white danced with tambourines. Banners proclaimed Henry, Lord of England, Flower of the World, Soldier of Christ. The procession included hundreds of captured French nobles walking in chains, forced to witness English celebration of their humiliation. Henry rode through crowds to St. Paul's Cathedral for a Thanksgiving service. Agincourt had transformed him from a controversial king into a national hero. England, fragmented and doubtful, suddenly felt itself one nation united by impossible victory. The psychological impact was profound. For the first time in 50 years, England believed it could dominate France. Henry would spend the rest of his life trying to make that belief reality. In Paris, news of Agincourt arrived like a plague. King Charles VI descended into another bout of madness, raving about glass bones and assassination plots. The French court fractured further between Armagnac and Burgundian factions. With 40% of the nobility dead, entire regions lost their lords simultaneously. Administrative systems collapsed. Military command structures ceased to function. Young heirs inherited titles they were unprepared to hold. The psychological damage exceeded even the physical losses. French military doctrine had been built on the supremacy of armored cavalry and noble courage. Agincourt had proven both obsolete. The longbow had made knights into targets. Mud had made armor into a death trap. The chivalric ideal, that noble blood and personal valor would always triumph, lay dead in a ploughed field in northern France. The immediate effect was not military, but social. Entire families had been erased. 3 brothers dead in the same afternoon. Fathers and sons killed within yards of each other. Noble lineages that had existed for centuries ended in the mud. French towns held mass funerals for men whose bodies could not be recovered. Wives became widows, not knowing exactly how their husbands had died. Children inherited titles at age 5. The French referred to October 25th, 1415, as the accursed day and avoided speaking its name. Chronicles written decades later still struggled to explain how it had happened. How had the finest army in Christendom been destroyed by exhausted, outnumbered English? No satisfactory answer existed except the truth. They had charged into a killing field and refused to retreat even as it devoured them. Henry did not rest on his victory. In August 1417, he returned to France with a larger army and a clear objective, the conquest of Normandy. This time he came prepared for a long campaign. He brought siege equipment, supplies for months, and administrators to govern captured territory. The French could not effectively resist. Too many experienced commanders had died at Agincourt. Regional armies lacked coordination. The civil war between Armagnac and Burgundian factions consumed French resources. Henry systematically captured Norman fortresses. Caen fell in 1417. Rouen, the capital of Normandy, was besieged and surrendered in 1419. For the first time in 2 centuries, Normandy was English again. Henry's victories seemed unstoppable. Agincourt had not just won a battle, it had broken French capacity to resist. By 1420, France was desperate for peace on any terms. The Treaty of Troyes, signed May 21st, gave Henry everything he had demanded. He would marry Catherine of Valois, daughter of King Charles VI. He was named regent of France and heir to the French throne. The Dauphin Charles was disinherited. Upon Charles VI's death, Henry would become king of both England and France. It was the greatest diplomatic triumph in English history. The union of 2 kingdoms seemed inevitable. Henry had achieved through 1 battle and 5 years of campaigning what no English king had managed in a century. He was 33 years old. He stood at the absolute peak of power. Then dysentery, the same disease that had nearly destroyed his army at Harfleur, caught him during the siege of Meaux. Henry V died on August 31st, 1422, at age 35 or 36. The bloody flux killed him slowly, emptying his body of strength and blood. He died in a castle near Paris, knowing his infant son would inherit 2 kingdoms. Henry VI was 9 months old, too young to remember his father, too young to understand what he had inherited, too young to hold what Henry V had won. Charles VI of France died 2 months later. The infant became King of England and France. But an infant king meant regency, and regency meant competing factions. The union of England and France required a strong hand. Without Henry, it began to unravel immediately. 7 years later, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc would appear. Everything Henry had won would be lost within a generation. By 1453, the 100 Years' War ended with English defeat. France had lost Agincourt but won the war. English holdings in France shrank to nothing. Not even Calais remained by 1558. Henry VI grew into a weak king prone to mental illness, unable to command or inspire. England descended into the Wars of the Roses, nobles fighting nobles for 30 years. The victory at Agincourt became memory, then legend, then myth. Shakespeare would write the play 2 centuries later, immortalizing Henry's "Band of Brothers" speech. But the actual military consequences of Agincourt proved temporary. The strategic situation returned to what it had been before 1415. France survived. England retreated. The mud and blood had changed nothing permanent on the map, but they had changed everything about warfare itself. The English longbow's dominance proved brief. It required lifetime training. Archers began as children, practicing every Sunday by law. You could not create longbowmen quickly. A skilled archer's skeleton showed the deformation. Left arm longer than right, spine curved from years of drawing 150-pound bows. This made longbowmen militarily effective but strategically limited. When the next generation of weapons arrived, the longbow became obsolete overnight. Gunpowder firearms required minimal training. A peasant could learn to fire an arquebus in a day. Guns were less accurate and slower to reload than bows, but they required no special breeding or decades of practice. By 1500, longbowmen had vanished from European battlefields. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself killed by progress. But its lesson remained. Technology and tactics defeat nobility and courage. Agincourt marked the beginning of the end for armored cavalry as the dominant military force. The process took another century, but the trajectory was set. Heavy cavalry continued to exist, but never again would they be considered invincible. The battles after Agincourt, Verneuil, Patay, Formigny, Castillon, all showed the same pattern. Cavalry charges could be stopped by prepared infantry with missile weapons and defensive terrain. The age of the knight had been built on 500 years of military supremacy. That supremacy died in October 1415. Knights became ceremonial figures, tournament champions, symbols of a past age. Real warfare moved toward professional infantry, artillery, and eventually gunpowder-armed common soldiers. The social implications were profound. If peasants with bows could kill nobles in armor, what justified the entire feudal hierarchy? The execution of prisoners at Agincourt violated every principle of chivalric warfare. Medieval combat among nobles had been governed by unwritten rules: capture for ransom, respect for rank, mercy for the defeated. Henry's order to kill helpless prisoners shattered that code. Contemporary chroniclers struggled with it. Even French sources did not blame Henry. They understood his tactical reasoning. But the precedent was set. Warfare was becoming total. Victory mattered more than honor. The romantic ideal of noble combat, knights jousting for glory, fighting with courtesy and respect, had always been more myth than reality. Agincourt exposed the myth completely. War was not glorious. It was mud and blood and terror, and the side willing to be more ruthless often won. Chivalry would persist in literature and ceremony, but on the battlefield it was dead. England and France remembered Agincourt differently. For England, it became the defining national myth. Outnumbered heroes defeating overwhelming odds through courage and skill. Shakespeare's Henry V immortalized this version. Every October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, became a celebration of English martial spirit. The battle proved England's superiority, its divine favor, its right to rule France. For France, Agincourt was trauma to be forgotten. French chronicles avoided detailed description. They referred to it obliquely as the accursed day, or simply did not mention it at all. When they did discuss it, they blamed internal treachery, bad weather, poor leadership, anything except English superiority. The two nations fought a memory war for centuries, each shaping Agincourt to fit their national narrative. Truth became impossible to separate from myth. The French should have learned from Agincourt. They did not. 10 years later at Verneuil in 1424, they made similar mistakes and suffered similar losses. At Patay in 1429, they finally adapted, attacking English archers before defensive positions could be prepared. But the adaptation came too late and cost too much. Military institutions resist change because change threatens the social order. French nobility could not accept that their blood and training no longer guaranteed victory. To admit longbowmen were superior was to admit peasants might be superior. That admission was socially impossible. So they kept charging, kept dying, kept blaming everything except their own obsolescence. It took a generation for French military doctrine to fully change. By then, artillery and gunpowder had rendered both longbows and armored cavalry obsolete. Everyone had become equally vulnerable. In the end, the mud decided everything. The rain that fell for days before October 25th transformed a ploughed field into a quagmire that made French numbers irrelevant. Heavy cavalry became trapped animals. Armored infantry became exhausted before reaching their enemy. English archers and men-at-arms, lighter and positioned on higher ground, retained mobility and strength. Terrain is often the forgotten element of military history. Commanders are praised or blamed, weapons are analyzed, tactics are studied. But at Agincourt, geography was destiny. Henry chose his position brilliantly. The French accepted it foolishly. The narrow field, the woods on both flanks, the mud, all favored defense over attack, light over heavy, prepared over impetuous. The French never had a chance. They were defeated before they charged. The mud had already killed them. Today, a small memorial stands near Agincourt. Tour buses rarely stop. The field is farmland now, peaceful and unremarkable. Nothing in the landscape suggests that 6,000 men died there in a single afternoon. The village of Agincourt hosts occasional reenactments, where enthusiasts in reproduction armor replay the battle for small crowds. Archaeologists have found arrowheads, armor fragments, and bones over the decades. The actual battlefield's exact location remains debated. 600 years of farming have erased the original topography. But the memory persists. British and French school children still learn about Agincourt, though they learn different lessons. For military historians, it remains a perfect case study in how terrain, technology, and tactics combine to destroy numerical superiority. For everyone else, it is simply the day mud and arrows killed chivalry. The finest armor in Europe had become coffins. The noblest blood in France had fertilized a field. And 6,000 commoners with bent wood and string had proven that the age of the knight was ending. Agincourt did not win the 100 Years' War. France recovered, expelled the English, and emerged stronger by 1453. But the battle destroyed something that could never be recovered, the belief system that had governed European warfare for half a millennium. Before Agincourt, military superiority belonged to those with noble blood, expensive armor, and years of training from childhood. After Agincourt, superiority belonged to those with better weapons, better tactics, and better use of terrain. The shift was not immediate. Knights continued to fight for another century, but they fought, knowing they were vulnerable. The invincibility was gone. Welsh peasants with 6-foot yew-bows had killed dukes and counts without knowing or caring who they were. That psychological wound never healed. Medieval warfare had been revolution disguised as tradition. Agincourt revealed the disguise. The death of 40% of French nobility in 6 hours created a power vacuum that took generations to fill. Entire regions lost their administrative structures simultaneously. Children inherited duchies. Inexperienced heirs commanded armies. The carefully constructed feudal hierarchy, built on the assumption that nobles were militarily indispensable, suddenly looked fragile. If common archers could destroy noble cavalry, what justified noble privilege? The question was dangerous. No one asked it directly in 1415, but it lingered over the next centuries as professional armies replaced feudal levies, as gunpowder made armor obsolete, as centralized monarchies diminished noble power. The question grew louder. Agincourt was not the cause of these changes, but it was the moment when the old order's mortality became visible. The mud had exposed what ceremony and tradition had hidden. Nobles bled the same as peasants. Shakespeare wrote Henry V in 1599, nearly 200 years after Agincourt. His band of brothers speech became more famous than the battle itself. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." It was beautiful. It was inspiring. It was complete fiction. Henry probably said something that day, but no contemporary source recorded it. What Henry actually did, dismount his knights, position his archers, exploit terrain, execute prisoners, was far less romantic than Shakespeare's version. But England needed the myth more than the truth. Agincourt became proof of English martial superiority, divine favor, and national character. The actual battle, desperate, brutal, decided by mud and arrows, was buried under layers of patriotic storytelling. Every nation needs origin myths. For England, Agincourt was one of them. The mud and blood were optional details. 600 years later, the field at Agincourt is quiet. Wheat grows where men died. No ghosts walk the furrows. The mud that decided a battle has been ploughed and planted for 6 centuries. Local farmers occasionally find rusted metal or bone fragments and donate them to the museum in Agincourt village. Historians still debate the exact location of the fighting. Topography changes over centuries, and medieval chronicles were imprecise about coordinates. But the location doesn't matter as much as what happened there. On October 25, 1415, in a muddy field in northern France, the medieval world order died. Armored cavalry lost its dominance. Noble blood lost its military superiority. Chivalric warfare lost its validity. And a new age began. An age of professional armies, gunpowder weapons, and total war. The transformation took centuries to complete. But it started in the mud at Agincourt, where 6,000 French nobles learned that courage and nobility could not stop arrows, and English peasants proved that technology defeats tradition. The field remembers nothing, but history remembers everything. They marched to Agincourt expecting glory and found only mud. They charged in the finest armor Europe could forge and drowned in 2 inches of bloody water. They believed their noble blood made them invincible and learned that peasants with better weapons disagreed. The age of knights did not end in a single afternoon, but it began ending there, in that narrow field, where terrain and technology and 5,000 yew-bows taught France a lesson written in 6,000 corpses. The future belongs not to those who claim superiority by birth, but to those who earn it through adaptation. Henry V won a battle but lost a war. England gained a myth but lost an empire. France suffered catastrophic defeat but survived to ultimate victory. But medieval warfare, built on the supremacy of armored nobility, died at Agincourt and never recovered. The mud kept the secret for 6 centuries. Then historians came, sifted through chronicles and bones, and found the truth. On St. Crispin's Day, 1415, the world changed. And nothing that followed would ever be the same.